It was one of those hot Saturday mornings where even the air feels tired, the kind where the yard sale signs droop on their staples, and you tell yourself you're just going to drive past. I was 53, semi-retired. A fridge full of microwave dinners waiting at home, when a cardboard sign in blocky handwriting caught my eye. Estate sale. Everything must go. I almost kept driving, but something about the uneven letters tugged at me. I turned in and parked by the curb. Walked past rows of folding tables covered in mismatched mugs, boxes of VHS tapes, stacks of church cookbooks, telling myself I was just browsing. Then on a corner table under the shade of a pop-up tent I saw it. A battered wooden recipe box with a brass clasp dulled by years of buttered fingers. My breath caught. My hands went cold, because it looked exactly like the box my mother had kept on our counter when I was a child. The box I hadn't seen since her funeral 6 years ago. I lifted the lid with shaking hands. And there they were, index cards stained with batter and penciled notes in her unmistakable slanted script. Add more cinnamon on one, serve hot to keep the peace on another. I whispered her name before I realized I was speaking. The woman behind the table looked up, flour on her cheek, and asked if I was all right. I nodded and asked how much for the box. $5, she said. I paid with a crumpled bill and held it like it might vanish if I blinked. Driving home, the grocery bag on the seat faded into the background. All I could see was the recipe box catching the sunlight. It felt impossible, like a message sent across time, like my mother had left a breadcrumb for me to find when I needed it most. I parked in my driveway, carried the box inside, and set it on the kitchen table where my own counters had been bare for years. My hands hovered above it, afraid to open it again, but unable to look away. And in that suspended moment, I realized my life was about to shift in a way I couldn't yet name. I sat at the table with the box in front of me and the late morning sun sliding across the wood. I flipped the clasp with my thumb and lifted the lid. The tiny creak sounded like a door opening in an old house. I pulled the first card and felt my throat tighten because the ink was unmistakable. It was my mother's hand, slanted forward like it had someplace kind to be. The top line read Sunday pot roast, and in the corner she had written sear darker than you think. Trust the browning. I smiled before I could stop myself. I took another card, cornbread muffins, with a buttery thumbprint sealing the edge. Underneath the ingredients she had written, serve hot to keep the peace. I laughed out loud at the kitchen table with no one to hear it. I kept going. Aunt Marie's apple crisp, Tuesday's soup, company cake, and the stack of ordinary index cards felt like a choir, every stain a note, every margin a harmony. I laid them in a fan on the table and the kitchen. Changed temperature, not the thermostat kind, the memory kind. I could hear her wool sweater sleeves brushing the counter. I could smell the brown sugar hitting hot butter. I could see the way she tilted her head when she read a recipe, as if listening for the part one couldn't hear. I found a folded scrap tucked behind, zucchini bread. It wasn't a card, just a torn piece of paper bag with a softer version of her handwriting. For days you feel alone, make something that takes time. I pressed my palm flat on the table and breathed like I was studying a boat. I said okay out loud to the empty room because it didn't feel empty anymore. I made a list on a sticky note the way she used to. Apples, oats, brown sugar, butter, lemon, cinnamon, vanilla. I stuck the note to my wallet, and then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the back door so the kitchen could hear the yard. I looked across the street and saw Mrs. Henderson out front watering her rose bushes. She waved. I waved back. We had been polite for 5 years without learning anything. I almost called to her to ask if she wanted apple crisp later, but my voice got shy. I closed the door and picked up my keys. I paused. And then I grabbed the box too because I didn't want to leave it alone. I carried it to the passenger seat like a toddler strapped into a car seat. I drove to the store and bought too many apples on purpose. I bought real vanilla and a lemon with skin that looked like sunshine. I bought oats that came in a cylinder I remembered from our pantry. I bought butter that came in sticks wrapped in paper that whispered when you opened it. I drove home and set it all on the counter. I placed the recipe card against the sugar jar where she had always propped them. And then I stalled. I stalled because courage is easiest to find when you're talking to someone. I took out my phone and scrolled to the photo I'd snapped of the yard sale sign. I zoomed in and saw the house number in the corner of the frame, I texted a stranger, "Hi, I'm the woman who bought the recipe box this morning. My name is Helen. I can't stop thinking about it. Can I ask you something about your aunt and my mother?" The three dots appeared, vanished, appeared, then a reply came. "This is Taylor. I'm here finishing the clean out. I just put a batch of lemon bars in the oven, and I could use a break. If you want to stop by, the back door is open." I stood there with the phone warm in my hand and felt relief spread through my shoulders like heat from an oven door. I put the apples in the fridge. I left the card where it was like a bookmark. I took the box again and went back. The house looked softer in the afternoon light. Taylor met me in the kitchen with flour on her shirt and the smell of sugar in the air. She was younger than me by a decade, maybe two, sleeves rolled, hair clipped up with a pen. She said the lemon bars needed 3 more minutes and asked if I wanted water. I asked if her aunt and my mother had been close. She said close like women get close when life makes them share. She said they met at the church rummage sale and became the kind of friends who knock instead of call. They traded recipes and birthdays and casseroles when the news was bad. She said her aunt had kept 2 recipe boxes, the one I bought and a newer one. She said when the storage unit got emptied after her aunt went into hospice, she had boxed everything with a cousin and things must have crossed. She said she hadn't recognized my name at the sale, but her aunt had told stories about a woman who always brought cornbread hot and insisted on extra napkins. I said that was my mother. Extra napkins were her love language. The timer rang and Taylor pulled the lemon bars out. I said the smell was a memory trickster. She said it's the only time machine she trusts. We stood side by side at a counter that knew our mothers, and we talked like people who had been assigned the same homework by different teachers. We sliced a square, and she insisted I take one on a paper plate for home. I told her I was going to try the apple crisp card tonight, and that I wasn't sure I remembered how to peel an apple without wasting half of it. She smiled without pity and said she lived 5 blocks over and could come mess up my kitchen respectfully if I wanted company. I surprised myself by saying yes before the sentence finished. She wiped her hands and wrote her number on the corner of a grocery list. She said, "Text me when your oven preheats." I drove home and felt the car lighter than physics allowed. I set the lemon bar on my table. I propped the card against the sugar again. I washed the apples the way she taught me, with patience and a towel. I peeled in cautious spirals and laughed when the skin broke anyway. I cut in quarters. I squeezed lemon. I measured cinnamon with my heart instead of the spoon. The kitchen began to smell the way a memory becomes a room. The doorbell rang and Taylor stepped in with a dish towel on her shoulder like a uniform. She looked around and nodded like a foreman approving a job site. She asked if I had a favorite pan for crisps. I said favorites had been boxed up 6 years ago and thrown in the back of a closet. She said then we'll make new favorites. We mixed oat and sugar and butter with our fingers until it looked like gravel and forgiveness. We tucked the pan into the oven. We washed the bowls. She told me her aunt had been the quiet glue of her family, I told her my mother had been the loud laughter of mine. We listened to the oven change sound near the end when the bubbling grows insistent. We pulled the pan and the heat came out like a hug. We ate too soon and burned our tongues and did not regret it. Taylor said we could start a notebook for our attempts and write truth in the margins. I said we could leave space for new favorites like my mother wrote on a blank card at the front of the box. The door clicked. I looked up and Mrs. Henderson stood on my porch with a jar in her hand and a face full of apology for interrupting. She said the whole street smells like Sunday. I asked if she liked apple crisp, and she said only every day that ends in Y. We cut her a square, and she told us about the summer her husband fixed the fence, and they ate crisp every night for a week from paper bowls with plastic spoons. I learned more about my neighbor in 7 minutes than I had in 5 years. I realized the door had been closed for a long time, and it wasn't just grief, it was habit. Taylor rinsed the bowls and said we should keep 2 extra plates near the sink from now on, not for anyone in particular, just for whoever the smell invites. I laughed and said my mother would approve. We wrote our first note in a clean spiral notebook, the date, the recipe, what went wrong, what went right. We added a line stolen from the card, "Sear darker than you think. Trust the browning," and below it we wrote, "Live the same way." I shut off the oven and opened the window a crack so the cinnamon could introduce me to the block. Taylor waved from the porch and promised to text before bed. I stood in the doorway with the recipe box under my hand and felt the house breathe like it had been holding its breath for 6 long years and was finally ready to exhale. By the next weekend, Taylor and I had turned the kitchen into a small workshop of memory. We decided we'd pick a different card every Saturday, no repeats until we'd tried them all. She brought her own apron this time, a faded yellow thing with flower ghosts on the pockets, and she laid it across a chair like a flag. We started with cornbread muffins, the card that said "Serve hot to keep the peace." The batter came together lumpy and hopeful. We spooned it into the tin, laughing at how crooked our scoops were. While it baked, she told me more about her aunt, how she had hosted a Tuesday soup night for lonely neighbors, how the smell of onions could fill a room with company. I told Taylor about the last Christmas I'd cooked a full meal for anyone, about my mother's apron still folded in a drawer. I could feel the air in the kitchen changing, less like a room and more like a memory being written in real time. When the timer dinged, the muffins were golden and the smell floated out the open window. Mrs. Henderson's head popped up over her rose bushes. "What's cooking over there?" she called. I hesitated, then held up the tray. "Cornbread muffins." She crossed the street, wiping her hands on her gardening gloves, and I cut her one still steaming. She took a bite, closed her eyes, and said, "I haven't tasted muffins like this since the church potlucks when your mother was alive." She stayed and told us about the summer she and my mother had canned peaches together, how they'd swapped recipes and gossiped over boiling water. As she talked, more faces appeared at the edge of the yard. Mr. Lee, walking his dog, slowed down, sniffing the air. A teenager on a skateboard stopped and asked if he could have one for research. We handed out muffins like business cards. They left smiling and promising to come back. That evening, after the kitchen was cleaned, Taylor pulled a fresh notebook from her bag. "Let's write it down," she said. We wrote the date, the recipe, who showed up, what we learned. At the bottom, she wrote a line from the card in bold, "Serve hot to keep the peace," and beneath it she added, "and keep the window open." As I closed the box and turned off the light, I realized the house didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It felt like a threshold. The box wasn't just handing me my mother's past. It was handing me my neighbors. The next weekend, I didn't even bother pretending it was just about cooking. I taped a scrap of paper to my mailbox that read, "Apple crisp at 4, open kitchen, all welcome." Taylor laughed when she saw it. "You're braver than I am," she said, tying on her yellow apron. We set out extra chairs around the kitchen table, laid an old quilt over the counter to make room for pans. I pulled Aunt Marie's apple crisp from the box and propped it up like a guest of honor. By 3 o'clock, the smell of cinnamon and sugar had begun to drift through the open windows again. Mrs. Henderson arrived first, this time with a jar of her peach jam and a photograph of my mother from a long-ago church picnic. Mr. Lee followed, holding a bag of lemons and a shy smile. Even the teenager with the skateboard came back, balancing a container of brownies he'd made with his mom. We peeled apples side by side. I showed a child how to measure oats with a dry cup. Taylor taught Mr. Lee the trick of cutting cold butter into flour. Laughter rose with the steam. People told stories about their own kitchens, their own mothers, their own mistakes. Someone burned the first batch of topping. Someone else suggested adding pecans. Nobody cared. As the crisp baked, I found myself leaning against the counter watching them, neighbors who had been silhouettes on sidewalks now moving easily in my kitchen. Taylor caught my eye and smiled, a little proud, a little amazed. "Look what your mom's box is doing," she whispered. When the timer beeped, we opened the oven and the heat rolled out like a welcome. We scooped into mismatched bowls and handed them out. People ate standing up, sitting on the porch steps, leaning against the doorframe. The sound was a low hum of spoons against ceramic and small sighs of pleasure. At the end, I set the box back on the counter and took a blank index card from the front. In my mother's handwriting at the top, it said, "Leave space for new favorites." I wrote the date and under it, "First open kitchen." Taylor added, "Serve hot to keep the peace and keep the window open." Mrs. Henderson signed her name. Mr. Lee drew a lemon in the corner. Even the skateboard kid wrote, "Best crisp ever." When everyone left, The house was a mess of crumbs and empty mugs, but it felt alive. I washed a pan while Taylor dried. She said softly, "You know this is going to get bigger, right?" I said, "I hope so." And I realized I wasn't afraid of the noise anymore. I wanted it. Within a month, the Saturday open kitchen was no longer an experiment. It had become a ritual. Every week, a new card from my mother's box guided the menu, and every week more neighbors drifted in through my open door carrying bowls, stories, and curiosity. Mrs. Henderson brought her peach jam again, but this time also her granddaughter, who perched on a stool and asked if she could stir. Mr. Lee began arriving with lemons already sliced and a bag of herbs from his garden. The skateboard kid, his name was Ben, we finally learned, started showing up early to set chairs. Each recipe became an excuse to hear another story. When we made Tuesday soup, a retired firefighter told us about eating that same soup after night shifts, how the smell of onions meant safety. When we baked company cake, a shy widow confessed it had been her late husband's birthday cake for 30 years. People left with food, but also with each other's phone numbers, promising to come back with their own recipes next time. Taylor and I kept our notebook on the counter, filling pages with dates, names, mishaps, and jokes. At the bottom of each page, we wrote a line from my mother's margins and added our own. Leave space for new favorites became leave space for new friends. Serve hot to keep the peace became serve hot, keep the door open. It wasn't always perfect. One rainy Saturday, the power went out halfway through a casserole, and we all sat in candlelight telling stories until it came back on, then ate it half-baked and laughed. Another week, a neighbor complained about the parking, and I thought the experiment might collapse, but Taylor suggested we take the next potluck to the community garden, and suddenly the problem became a picnic. Through all of it, my relationship with Taylor deepened. We weren't just co-hosts, we were becoming each other's chosen family. She told me about her own quiet struggles, her father's illness, the way she'd felt adrift after her aunt died. I told her about the empty holidays, the years of microwave dinners, the apron in my drawer. We built trust over flour and spilled sugar, over burnt edges and second attempts. One evening, after everyone left and the kitchen was a mess of crumbs and mugs, Taylor said softly, "I think your mom would have loved this." I felt my throat tighten and nodded. "I think she sent it," I whispered. And as I wiped the counter, I realized this wasn't just about food anymore. It was about stitching together the torn edges of a life, one recipe at a time, until the whole street smelled like belonging. By autumn, the open kitchen had outgrown my little house. Every Saturday, more people arrived until the chairs spilled into the yard. Children played on the porch steps while adults passed bowls through the screen door. It was no longer just me, Taylor, and a handful of curious neighbors. It was the street. We decided to move our next gathering to the community garden where there was more space and fresh air. Taylor designed a handwritten sign with flourishes and taped it to the notice board. Community table, recipes from the box, bring a dish or a story. On the day of the move, the weather was crisp and bright. We carried out folding tables, set the recipe box at the center like a guest of honor, and waited. They came in twos and threes, some with casserole pans, others with jars of jam, a few with nothing but a story. Mrs. Henderson arrived early to help set up. Mr. Lee came with a basket of herbs. Ben, the skateboard kid, carried chairs like he was training for a strongman contest. My sister even showed up, arms full of copies she'd made of our mother's most requested recipes. We made Tuesday soup that day in a huge pot over a portable burner. People took turns stirring. Each edition came with a memory, a pinch of thyme from a grandmother's garden, a squeeze of lemon from a first date gone right, a handful of rice from a family's rainy day tradition. The smell built like a chorus. Taylor and I moved among the tables handing out bowls and hearing bits of people's lives. A retired teacher told us the cornbread reminded her of snow days. A young couple said they'd met at a church bake sale and hadn't cooked together since. My sister showed Ben how to peel apples in one ribbon without breaking it. We still wrote everything down in the notebook. Only now it wasn't just our handwriting. People lined up to add their names, doodles, and lines. Someone wrote, "Today I tasted a memory I didn't know I had." Another wrote, "This smells like belonging." At the end, As the sun dipped low and the garden lights flickered on, Taylor put her arm through mine and whispered, "Look at them. This is bigger than recipes now." I looked around at the tables, the laughter, the smell of soup rising in the cool air, and I felt a lump in my throat. The box had stopped being an heirloom. It had become a bridge. And every Saturday, it carried more people across. Every story that builds a community has a day when that community is tested. Ours came in midwinter, on a Saturday when freezing rain turned the sidewalks slick and gray. We had planned a company cake day at the community garden, but by noon only Taylor and I were there, huddled under the oak with the recipe box wrapped in a towel. We waited for someone to come, laughing at our own stubbornness, but the cold cut through our coats. "Maybe it's over," I whispered. Taylor blew into her hands and shook her head. "It's not over. People are just waiting to see if it matters next week too." Back at my house, I tried to bake anyway. The batter came together heavy and slow. Taylor sat at the counter, uncharacteristically quiet. I realized how much she had been carrying, the calls she'd been making, the ingredients she'd been buying, the grief she'd been pushing aside. I put down the mixing spoon and asked if she was okay. She stared at the bowl and said, "I was scared after my aunt died that I'd never have a kitchen full of people again. This box gave me one. I just don't want to lose it." Her voice cracked on the last word. Without thinking, I reached across the counter and took her flour-dusted hands. "You're not going to lose it," I said. "You built it. I just opened a door. You gave it legs." She laughed a little and wiped her eyes with the dish towel. "Okay," she said softly, "then let's bake it anyway." We poured the heavy batter into the pan and slid it into the oven. While it baked, we made a plan. Next Saturday, we would host the meal inside the community hall. No matter the weather, we'd send handwritten invitations instead of a note on the board. We'd make sure everyone knew they were welcome. We wrote the plan in our notebook like a promise. When the timer beeped, we opened the oven and the cake had risen higher than either of us expected, golden and fragrant. The kind of smell that dares the cold to stay. We cut thick slices and ate them standing at the counter, crumbs falling, steam fogging the window. It wasn't a crowd, but it was enough. The quiet between us was no longer fear. It was resolve. The following Saturday, we opened the doors of the small community hall at noon. Taylor and I had arrived early with folding tables, the recipe box, and a handwritten stack of invitations we'd slid under every door on the block. We brewed coffee in 2 giant urns and laid out mismatched plates and mugs. Outside, the weather was still raw and gray, but inside smelled of onions, apples, and anticipation. By 1 o'clock, the first neighbor stepped through the door, shaking off her coat, then another, then a family with 2 children carrying a tray between them. In less than half an hour, the hall was full of voices, coats hanging from every hook, tables pushed together. Mrs. Henderson brought her peach jam again, but this time with homemade biscuits. Mr. Lee arrived with a basket of herbs and a small lemon tree he'd grown from a cutting. Ben rolled in a borrowed cart stacked with bread from a local bakery. Even my sister showed up with 2 sheet cakes and a shy smile. We made Tuesday soup, again in a huge pot at the front of the room. People lined up to stir, each adding something and telling where it came from. A retired teacher dropped in a handful of noodles from my mom's pantry. A young dad added smoked paprika because it tastes like my grandma's kitchen. The smell built slowly, layer upon layer, until the hall smelled like 100 kitchens at once. Taylor moved among the tables with her yellow apron, laughing and refilling mugs. I stood at the front, ladling soup into bowls, watching neighbors hand them down the line. For a moment, I saw my mother in every gesture, the way someone tucked a napkin under a chin, the way another patted a child's back, and my eyes stung. When everyone had a bowl, we sat together on folding chairs, eating and talking. People who'd lived 3 doors apart for 10 years learned each other's names. Someone suggested making it a monthly event. Someone else volunteered to bring a crock-pot next time. Afterwards, Taylor and I packed up the last of the dishes. She leaned against the counter and said softly, "We did it. Even in winter, they came." I nodded, wiping a ladle. "It's not just us anymore. It's them." We opened the recipe box and took out the blank card at the front. In big letters, I wrote, "First Winter Gathering." Taylor added soup tasted like 100 kitchens. Mrs. Henderson signed it before she left. Ben drew a skateboard with steam lines. We tucked it back into the box, a living record.as. We locked the hall and stepped into the cold evening. I realized the test was over. This wasn't a novelty. It was a habit of care. And habits of care, once established, are hard to lose. By early spring, we had stopped calling it open kitchen and started calling it Sunday table, because it didn't matter what day it was or whose house we used. The point was that the table belonged to everyone. This time we decided to make a full meal from 3 of my mother's cards at once: Sunday pot roast, company cake, and Aunt Marie's apple crisp. My sister came early with copies of the cards and a determination to help. Taylor arrived with her yellow apron and a small bouquet of herbs from the community garden. We turned the community hall into a kitchen. Folding tables lined with cutting boards, knives, and bowls. People came in shifts. Some chopped onions, some peeled apples, some greased pans. Children carried napkins and counted chairs. Someone set up a record player in the corner and put on old Motown. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat, sugar caramelizing, apples softening under cinnamon.as. We cooked. Stories rose like steam. Mr. Lee told the tale of his first Thanksgiving in America and how he'd tried to make stuffing with rice because he didn't know the word. Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter learned how to crimp a pie crust from Taylor. My sister told Ben about the time our mother had burned a roast on purpose to teach us how to salvage mistakes. People listened, laughed, and added their own confessions. When the food was ready, we lined the tables with mismatched dishes, and everyone served themselves. The noise fell to a contented murmur as people ate, and in that moment the hall felt like a single, breathing kitchen. I sat between Taylor and my sister, watching neighbors lean across tables to pass bread, watching a teenager refill an older man's coffee. The ache of the last 6 years, microwave dinners, quiet holidays, unopened apron drawers, loosened in my chest. After the plates were cleared, my sister stood up and held one of the copied recipe cards. "This started with a box my mom kept on her counter," she said, voice shaking a little. "But it's become all of this. Thank you for showing up." She sat down, squeezed my hand, and whispered, "Mom would be proud." Taylor reached into the box and pulled the blank card from the front. She handed me the pen. In big letters I wrote, "First Sunday table, full meal." Taylor added, "Smelled like belonging." My sister wrote, "Thank you, Mom," in the corner. People lined up to add their names, doodles, and notes until the card was full. We tucked it back in the box. Later, after everyone had gone and the hall was quiet except for the hum of the fridge, Taylor and I sat on the edge of a table with 2 mugs of cooling coffee. She said softly, "6 months ago this was just a box at a yard sale." I nodded. "And 6 years ago it was just my mother's recipes." She smiled. "And now it's a community." I looked at the box sitting between us, full of cards and now full of signatures, and felt something settle in me. A catharsis, not like a thunderclap, but like a door quietly closing on loneliness. I realized I'd rebuilt not just a kitchen but a life, one Saturday at a time. Driving home that night, I thought about how close I'd come to ignoring that estate sale sign, to deleting the chance without even opening it. And I wondered how many doors we all pass every day that could lead to connection if only we'd knock. So I'll leave you with this. What small thing could you do, or not walk past, that might turn into the meal, the friendship, or the community you didn't know you were missing?